You know, Dr. Davis, we are so honored to finally talk to you because, you know, it all started last year when I was watching C-SPAN, and I was just completely taken, and I mean taken, by your presentation about your new book, what's the secret history of the war on cancer.
Right.
At any rate, I was watching this book interview, and I don't know where it was located, what the location was, but I was totally compelled by your testimony about these issues on cancer and a variety of other issues. So we, on the Cutting Edge, are incredibly honored to finally see you and to talk about these issues for the world, because our show is going to go all over the world and people are going to see it, and deservedly so. Now, you happen to be a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, is that correct?
Correct.
In epidemiology.
Right.
So will you start off by answering the pivotal question, what is epidemiology?
Like most words, it comes from two Greek words. Epi meaning upon, and demos meaning the people. And epidemiology studies the effects of different things on the people and how their lives, their deaths, their health, even the sex of the children is affected by things that happen in time and place. So epidemiology looks at patterns of disease in people in order to understand the causes of those patterns and ultimately to figure out how to prevent disease and promote health.
Now, you know, about, what was it, 5 years ago or more, you wrote one of the first public novels, I guess, called Smoke That Runs Like Water.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Right, When Smoke Ran Like Water.
When Smoke Ran Like Water, and it was about a place called Denora, Pennsylvania.
Right, which very few people have ever heard of.
And oddly enough, is that the place of your birth?
Well, it's the place I grew up.
Okay.
It was famous, but I heard about it only after I left. It was famous kind of in the way that Jack the Ripper was
We
famous.
don't want to dwell on it too much, but I
Right.
think we should mention, you know, what event happened in 1948 that compelled you to write this story.
Well, in 1948, in one 12-hour period of time, 20 people dropped dead.
From what?
Well, they said it was an act of God. They said it was a freak of nature. They said it was bad weather. And it was all of those things, but it also was the fumes from the mills and the coal mines and the coal stoves and the coke ovens and the rolling plant and the iron furnaces that all combined with a mass of stationary air that settled over the Little Valley area. And instead of those hot fumes going away and dissipating, as they normally would do with regular winds and rains in the fall, the mass of stationary cold air settled over the area, an inversion, if you will, and it prevented those fumes from rising. A hot air balloon rises normally and cools as it does, but those fumes got smacked back down to the valley floor. And as a result, the stifling pollution from the mills remained with people, and within a few days, people began to drop dead, sometimes in their homes, sometimes in the mills.
Let me ask this, what about this guy John L. Lewis? Was he I think he was a mine worker, union guy back in those days, wasn't he, or not?
Well, I'm not familiar with him per se,
Right.
but I can tell you that the unions of Denora were very much in favor of keeping the mill operating because, after all, the mills kept everybody employed, and it was a very tough thing to even think about the possibility that the same things that kept the town employed could have had anything to do with the poor health of some people there.
These are the traditional coal mines we hear about all over that were being from the West Coast or other parts of the country,
Right.
Florida or wherever. There are no coal mines, but in your neck of the woods, there are lots of coal mines.
There were even mom and pop coal mines and some mom and pop little mills and foundries and things like that.
West Virginia is a big coal mining state.
Right.
And we didn't know that Pennsylvania was as big a coal
Well, it
mine.
wasn't so much a coal mining area, although there is a lot of coal in Pennsylvania even to this day,
Right.
as it was an area where the three rivers, the Monongahela and the Allegheny, meet to form the Ohio.
We know about that from Terry Bradshaw. Okay,
All
go
right.
ahead. Yeah.
And that three-river area became an area which was one of the central areas for steel making, because you need a tremendous amount of water to make steel, and you need coke ovens to bake the coal to create coke. Basically, coke is baked coal.
That's the hottest form on the planet, isn't it? It really is. It's what melts steel. Otherwise, without the coke, you couldn't melt steel. Is that correct?
Right, and you need these huge furnaces with tremendous amounts of heat. And all of the operations of the Denora mills were fueled by coal at the time. Now, as soon as this thing happened, they began to switch to natural gas, which burns much cleaner than does coal. But it was a combination of these things. It wasn't any one of them. And there was one special ingredient in Donora, and that was the zinc mill. And the zinc ovens smelted out from the zinc ore and cooked the zinc and baked it at extremely high temperatures. And as a result of the materials used in the production of zinc, you got, I think, a very reactive fluoride gas.
This is just a small part of the story we want to tell about Dr. Devra Davis today. And one of the things that I really want to get into, and as I mentioned when I was watching C-SPAN, was so compelling, was the fact that you're an environmentalist across the board, first and foremost. Or are you?
Well, environmentalist has been a kind of negative word in our culture, and I think for some good reasons, because I think environmentalists have not always embraced scientific grounds for some of the things that they do.
Okay.
So I'm an advocate on behalf of the environment, but I do it based on the very firm scientific understanding that my colleagues and I have developed about the ways that the environment affects our lives.
Okay, now let's jump here into this book, because I just was so taken by it. The name of if you can hold that book up for us just a minute, a little higher. I'll tell you there. Yeah, to the side of your face so we can see your face too. No, there. That's it. You're tricking me always. Like, I know girls do that to me. Okay, that's perfect. That is exactly right. You can put the book down. At any rate, Dr. Davis, that was the book that said The Secret War.
Secret History of the War.
The Secret History of the War on Cancer. And you name 3 pretty bad players in this book. One of them is asbestos, and one of them is benzene, and one of them is, what's the other one?
Vinyl chloride.
What's it called?
Vinyl chloride is another.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And those are all been around for a long time, haven't they?
They have indeed, yes.
And how long have they been around?
Well, benzene and vinyl chloride were created, early in the industrial era. Benzene actually in the 19th century, vinyl chloride in the 20th century. Asbestos has actually been around since the time of Charlemagne.
Really?
Charlemagne actually had a linen woven asbestos tablecloth that he would throw into the fire because it was fireproof and get rid of all the scraps.
Sure.
So asbestos has been around really for quite a long time and was known for quite a long time to be dangerous. Benzene was known from the time it was first developed and synthesized to be able to get right into the bone marrow and to cause what we now understand is a form of leukemia.
And for those that aren't too familiar with this, there's something called mothballs that everybody used to play with in their grandmother's closet when they were growing up, and it was dichlorobenzene, and it was naphthene, and all these other things that were in these mothballs.
Right.
With this really terrible smell that kind of...
Well, you can still buy them in the United States today. It's still legal to buy mothballs, and unfortunately, they can contain 100% naphthalene, which, among other things, comes right off the coke ovens. A form of it comes right off coke ovens, and we know it causes cancer in animals and humans, and it does. It's very effective against moths. Unfortunately, it's the same thing that allows it to be effective against moths, also allows the fumes to get into your lung and to affect your bone marrow.
Let me ask the question, and I know everyone wants to know the answer to. You've been teaching at the University of Pittsburgh for how many years?
Well, Pittsburgh, I've been there for about 4 years.
Okay.
Right, but I've been teaching overall for about 25 years.
Okay. Now, what compelled you to write this book?
Because I could write it now, and I couldn't have written it the 20 years ago when I first tried to. Because I think that we've matured as baby boomers, and more of us are reaching the age of some distinction, where we are seeing many of our friends not get the privilege of getting old as we are. We're seeing increased rates of cancer in our friends and loved ones, and I myself think of myself as a cancer orphan, although of course as an adult who loses your parents, you're not allowed to call yourself an orphan. But having lost my father, who faced a diagnosis of bone cancer when he was 54, and said to me he'd lived a long life at 54.
I know my mother passed away at 53 with bone cancer.
Really?
Yes.
And you know what a terrible disease it is.
Of course.
And realizing, as I have an incredible picture in here of my dad when he was a 2-year-old sitting on top of the family dry cleaning bench in the store that blew up just a few months later, and where my grandmother rescued him from the burning flames of a benzene fire. and that my father then spent his life as a boy. He worked in the factory with benzene as a chemist in the mills, and he was very proud to have a job in the mills.
Let me ask you this, because as we say, we have something here seriously in common. My mom passed away at 53 from bone cancer, your father at 54. There are people that are watching this show that are going to say this was a hereditary fluke, that we were just, it wasn't anything that they were around that did this. This was just their biological clock that said your time's up.
Well, you know, I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about genes, okay? Let me give you an example that we discussed in the work that we do at our Center for Environmental Oncology. If you have identical twins, they come from one egg that splits into two at conception and develops two close to identical pieces of embryo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Two human beings that are close to identical. At age 3, if you look at their chromosomes, which we can do, they look pretty much too identical. But at age 50, if you look at their chromosomes, they don't even look related to one another. So what is that telling us? Identical twins, according to studies done in Sweden, don't get the same cancer, and yet they're as close to a clone as we have in human nature. So I think we need to rethink our understanding of genes and the environment. Think of it this way. Genes give us the gun, but the environment decides whether the trigger gets pulled and where it's aimed. And that is increasingly the understanding of the relationship of genes in our environment. So for instance, 1 in every 10 women who gets breast cancer is born with defects in her genes. But all cancer comes about because the genes that we were born with are changed by what we eat and where we work and where we live and a lot of other things that happen to us throughout our lifetimes. So we do get cancer because our genes stop doing their job of telling cells to stay in control. Our genes work to repair damage because all of us will get cancer from time to time, and we'll get the cancer repaired. Early on, it will be snuffed out by healthy genes, by our immune system that says, oh, you're a bad cell, get back in line, or even you're a bad cell, go die and get out of here. But when you lose the ability to repair damage, that's when cancer happens. And that's why we can say that all cancer comes about when your genes stop working, but most cancer is not born, but made.
One of the things that I'm going to bring to your attention, you might have already known this, but if not, it's just a side effect. We just did a show on aging recently with Dr. Stephen Clark from UCLA, and he was talking about the serotonins and the fact that these things divide and get shorter and shorter and shorter, and finally they stop dividing by repetition. This is a lot about what you're kind of talking about. So you're basically saying that we start off with X, and then when you add the Y factor of environment and the requirement for those cells to redivide, maybe because of the environmental hazards that we face, that it increases that frequency.
Absolutely, and there's evidence, in fact, that we're getting more cancer at earlier ages. So the average age, for example, of pancreatic cancer has changed. Patrick Swayze is the most recent tragic example of pancreatic cancer in a fairly young man.
Right.
And we are seeing younger people with more serious diseases, whether it's Michael Fox with his Parkinson's disease or more young cases of cancer today.
Right. Now, so you've gotten this book, you decided to write this book about the basics. I'm not joking when I tell you this, but back in the 40s, they were talking about the differences between, is it heredity or is it the environment, regarding all phases of disease in this country. So what are we doing now different in the year 2008 that we didn't do in, 68 years ago or something in the 1940s?
Well, we have made a lot of progress, okay? We have 10 million cancer survivors in the United States today.
All right.
1 million of them is under the age of 40. Lance Armstrong is not alone. Mr. Armstrong seems to have the opinion that all we need is more money for cancer research. And frankly, somebody ought to tell him he's wrong. We don't just need more money. We need to spend it on the right things. And we haven't been doing that. We've not been spending on figuring out how to prevent cancer or prevent it from recurring. We've been focusing on finding the disease and treating it. Now, as someone who lost both my parents to cancer and they got excellent care at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, I appreciate the importance of treatment. But you know what? If we only become more efficient at finding and treating cancer, we'll never make any headway against this disease. And that's why in my book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, I say we've been fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapons. against the wrong enemies. Because think about this. We're trying to find the disease and kill the disease, but we are completely ignoring, until very recently, tobacco as a cause of cancer. And we knew tobacco caused cancer in the 1930s and 40s. We didn't try to act on tobacco as a cause of cancer until maybe 10 years ago.
And the same thing goes for these environmental glitches, or the benzenes and the asbestos and these other, what is that, chloride, fluoride, or
Vinyl chloride.
vinyl chloride.
Vinyl chloride.
Those are examples of cancer-causing, or carcinogens as they are, right?
Right.
And everybody knows it. Why aren't we regulating those? Why aren't we stopping the use of them, or slowing that down?
I think that there was a cartoon character, you may remember, Pogo, by a guy named Walt Kelly, and at one point he said, "We've met the enemy, and it's us." So I don't think it's one person, one institution. It's, in fact, we have grown up in a society that expects to have pills for ills, that expects to be able to solve problems with a quick fix, that has a naive faith in technology, that doesn't realize that technology comes sometimes with a double-edged sword to it, and that some of the same technologies, for example, diagnostic radiation, that can save lives, when misused, can also cause disease. And I think that part of the problem is that our own cultural attitude has been one of assuming that more is always better, and that some of the technologies that we rely on are inherently safe, when the truth of the matter is we are ignorant often of the long-term implications of some of these technologies.
I'm going to ask you, we're going to go on in this interview process. I'm going to bring to people's attention, because I know it's like having the Encyclopedia Britannica when you're sitting here, but one of the things, I'd like to break these two very important elements down. One of them is, as you mentioned, is that the technology that we're using to treat disease, and then the other one are the drugs that we're treating disease with. And I know you have strong feelings about both of those issues. But let's go back, and I'm going to revisit this issue about the benzenes, about the basic things that we're not regulating as a country. And I'd like to know from your studies, are they doing anything different in Europe than they are in Asia or in the United States? And one more question I have to throw into that mix, and everybody says, how can you afford heating oil if we don't use coal, or we don't use these other these old technologies? So,
all right. First of all, there are definitely different things happening in Europe. I met just 2 days ago with the Director General of the Environment of the European Union, Kirsten Niblaeus, and Dr. Niblaeus confirms that the European Union, which now represents almost 500 million people, so it's a much larger market than the United States is right now, the European Union is moving toward a program of using fewer toxic chemicals in their consumer products than we allow now. So, for example, my grandchildren's bottoms can be subject to a known carcinogen in a shampoo or bubble bath that's banned in Europe. Now, that's ridiculous. Why should European babies' bottoms be safer than my grandkids? And she's involved, and the European Union has been involved for some years, in getting rid of things that are suspected of causing cancer in humans, because they have a different approach, and it's an approach that I think we should take. They say if something causes cancer in a male or female mouse or rat, we should assume it's going to cause cancer in humans. We've increasingly moved in the direction of saying, no, this animal studies, we can't rely on that, because after all, we're different from a mouse or a rat. Well, let me tell you something. We're different. We're not that different. We differ from the mouse genome by 300 of 30,000 genes. That's not a whole lot, really. And every compound that we know for sure causes cancer in humans will also cause it in animals when adequately tested. Now, so what has the response been in industry? Well, they've stopped doing animal testing. And by the way, we have the lowest rate of starting animal testing in the U.S. government in modern history. That's been the response. People don't realize that the federal budget is a very powerful instrument of public policy. And if you don't want to know the answer to a question, you don't ask. And if you don't want to do the research or the monitoring on what the environment is doing to our health, you don't fund that research. The National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, which has been our flagship institute for this kind of research, has the lowest funding it's ever had in its history for testing the toxicity of chemicals.
One of the things that everyone will relate to very quickly is the fact that the toys with the painted lead bottoms on them or whatever from China.
Right.
And of course, add that to the list of many things that are produced in China or in other countries for low-cost labor purposes, and then brought here. And why isn't there some oversight to this?
Well, first of all, most Americans are unaware that the Food and Drug Administration doesn't have the authority to routinely measure contaminants in cosmetics, in personal care products. They don't. The Consumer Product Safety Commission doesn't have the authority to be monitoring routinely for contaminants like lead in plastic toys that come from China. And by the way, it's not just lead paint on things, which is a problem, or lead in little pieces of jewelry, which is a problem. It's the fact that lead can be used in plastic itself, even in teething toys. I thought one of the most remarkable things I've ever heard of in modern times was the director of the Consumer Product Safety Commission testifying before Congress that no, we don't really need any more money to be spent. We don't need the budget increase for the Consumer Product Safety Commission. We can do what we need to do. Well, that's ridiculous, of course, and I think the American people understand that they should have a right to protect their children and their pets, which was another issue of contamination from China, as dogs and cats were poisoned by contaminated dog food.
Exactly. Let's point to those lobbyist groups that would support that issue, support that position. In other words, you have a speaker for that particular agency, but they don't say these things without having some power group behind them that they're supporting that position. Is that correct or not?
Well, I think obviously it's correct, and there's very powerful factors here. But I kind of think that it's people have to think a little bit more about their children and grandchildren than they do, and there's a kind of hubris that is going to catch us soon enough on these issues. And American people are sick and tired of being sick and tired and of hearing the same old excuses here. And although I gather that the Chamber of Commerce testified that we didn't need more protection with respect to contaminants from China, I think even within the Chamber of Commerce there's been a lot of movement now to take a more progressive position. And I'm very encouraged, by the way, by people in big business who are coming to me saying that, look, we recognize we've got to clean up our act. We know that green is the new red, white, and blue. The companies that are going green are making the most money, despite what's going on in the worldwide crisis in the markets. And in fact, I think it's important to realize that the war on cancer has been a tremendous market failure.
Let's circle that back to what your book says, because you start off, what is it, 1971?
Yeah, 1971, the president declares war on cancer.
That was Nixon.
Right.
And he says,
we're going to end this. By the bicentennial, we will have wiped cancer off the map.
Which is
5 years later.
Yeah, 5 years later.
Guess what? Even 7 years earlier, the Surgeon General issues a report clearly saying that smoking causes cancer. But the president doesn't have anything to say about smoking in 1971 when he announces war on the disease. What does that tell you? It tells you that, in fact, the tobacco industry was absolutely staunchly behind the war on cancer in the beginning. In fact, the first director of the American Cancer Society left his job in 1954 to become head of the Tobacco Industry Research Council. And the tobacco industry actively funded the American Medical Association throughout the 1960s and 70s and sponsored major advertising in the American Medical Association. And at one point gave the American Medical Association $10 million to develop a safe cigarette. So the AMA was actually doing research for the tobacco industry. This is a story that a lot of people don't know about. That's why I wrote the book.
One of the things also that I think is really amazingly important is that we spent, the amount of money spent. I think you mentioned in the book how much we've spent on the war on cancer. Do you have a kind of an idea?
Well, we've spent billions of dollars at this point, close
to
40
billion?
billion.
How many?
40 billion. That's
Only
B.
40 billion, okay.
Yeah, but that's misleading.
All right.
That's government money alone.
All right.
We spend $100 billion a year right now
Okay.
in treating people with cancer.
Okay.
100 billion, that's with a B, dollars. And you can't spend infinite money on infinite health. And no matter how efficient we might get at finding and treating cancer, and we've become much more efficient, We've got to reduce the demand for the disease. And our failure to do that is a tremendous market failure.
You know that there's a bunch of clubs in the world that we don't ever get close to. We don't get to the skirt or the areas and where these people gather to with their ideas about life. And one of them is that, you know, that's just collateral damage. That people that we're spending this $100 billion on this, but guess what it gives us? It gives us cheap fuel, it gives us cheap goods at Walmart, it saves us all this money, it makes our economy go. How do you answer those critics?
Well, I think the chickens have come home to roost, and because not only are we seeing more cancer in some young people today, and the research that I'm doing with researchers at the NIH show that we're seeing more cases of cancer that have nothing to do with smoking and nothing to do with aging. Not only are we seeing greater patterns of cancer that aren't related to smoking or aging, but we're seeing problems globally that we can't explain except by the increased production and use of toxic chemicals. For example, the polar bears, 1 out of 100 of them in the last survey conducted is a hermaphrodite, right? We're seeing more and more beluga whales with male and female genitals
What does that
intact.
mean?
A beluga whale, what is a hermaphrodite?
Yes.
A hermaphrodite is an animal that can look like a male and a female at the same time. So, for example, in the polar bear, they'll have a testis and an ovary. And that's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to have one or the other. Now, can't tell you what the normal rate of hermaphrodites should be in a polar bear, but 1 in 100 is very, very high. And a polar bear is at the top of the Arctic food chain, and they're showing up with residues in their fat of toxic material that would qualify them for burial in a hazardous waste site.
Again, I'm going to be the counter to this argument because I need your feedback on this. The average hardcore business guy on Wall Street is going to say, "Hey, so who cares about the polar bears?" That's
Right.
what they're going to say. I mean, they're
that's
just
fine.
going to say it doesn't matter. You know how many polar bears
Well, you know,
there are.
we can take the polar bear and try to preserve them and grow them in zoos and see that they'll be interesting creatures for people to look at. They're absolutely, it's right. What does it matter? Well, I'll tell you why it matters. Because the polar bears aren't alone, okay? And what's happening to the polar bears is sending us a message. Because these polar bears, how do they get toxic materials in their fat? They're not working in factories, right? They're getting the toxic materials in their fat because even if we ban something in the United States or Europe, it gets used in China or in the developing countries without protection, without notice of the dangers and hazards. And then with the global circulation of pollution, it can get into the troposphers, into the stratosphere, rain down in the global ice cap, get into the smaller fish that move into the larger fish, and at the top of the food chain in the Arctic is the polar bear. Well, what's at the top of the human food chain? A nursing baby.
One of the things that I want to bring up to you right now is that there's a thing called perchlorates that has inundated the water supply of the United States a lot, along with MTBEs and other things. But perchlorates in particular seem to be doing the same thing you're talking about. They go up in the atmosphere, they rain down and go into our snowpack, and then they run down into our water supply. And cows that ingest these perchlorates, this rocket fuel as it were, when they produce their milk, that milk is poisoning the babies that were being nursed.
Yes, perchlorate is moving throughout the food chain as well, and it is in fact a contaminant of indication of rocket fuel. And that's one of the major challenges in many areas now of the country. In Fallon, Nevada, they've got a cluster of childhood leukemia, and they have areas with high perchlorate, perhaps high tungsten as well. And we have great difficulty in human research pinpointing the causes of, for example, an elevated rate of childhood leukemia. But perchlorate is an excellent example because it also seems to be moving up the food chain and being widely distributed.
Dr. Davis, we thank you for being with us this afternoon. Back in 94, or from 94 to 99, you were appointed by President Bill Clinton to the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigative Board.
Yeah.
Were you able to accomplish a mission there? Did
No.
you get support?
No.
Tell us about it.
I became a lady in waiting. What happened is in 1994, you may remember, in October, the Democrats were in charge. I was confirmed, I was nominated by the president to a presidential level appointment to help run the National Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. In November, the Congress changed, and actually it changed to Republican, and ironically, the Clinton administration undermined their own appointees and was never intending really to see us come into positions of power. And the real story, which isn't in my book, but it's probably worth telling to you guys, is that Ann Simpson, the wife of Senator Alan Simpson, had been a friend of mine because of our work on breast cancer. And I was at the goodbye party for George Mitchell, the Senate Majority Leader, and I'd been talking to her, and she knew that my appointment was languishing, and she said, "Oh, I think we should be able to do something about this." And Alan Simpson was quite a character, and very smart guy, and not one to take any guff from anyone. And also, as you may know, very tall man. And Bobby Byrd, the senator from West Virginia, is very short, very powerful. And he was holding up my appointment, and I knew that. He was holding up the appointment of supposedly Democratic people. And he was doing it because he was in cahoots with some people in the chemical industry at the time. I shouldn't say in cahoots, I should say that he was responding to pressure from his constituents. That's what a good senator does.
It's a safer way to say it.
Right.
From super lobbyist.
All of this, of course, is hearsay. But what Senator Simpson introduced me to Senator Byrd, because they were both on the committee that was supposed to vote on and get our confirmation going. And our confirmation had gone, but the budget was being held up, and the appointment papers were being held up. So Senator Simpson introduces me to Senator Byrd. And after his wife says, "Dear, you're not going to let them do this to Dr. Davis, are you?" And he says, "Well, I've heard that she's actually pretty reasonable." And so, "Senator Byrd, how do you do?" And I said, "Hello, Senator Byrd. Glad to meet you. I'd like to talk to you about our budget for the Chemical Safety Board, because I think it would be really important to release that from your hold." And he looked straight through me and he said, "I did not come here to talk about your budget," and turned on his heels and walked away. I was dismissed. Well, actually, because some other Republicans decided that this could be an interesting issue as well, we ultimately did get the budget. And the Chemical Safety Board ultimately was given a budget, and I helped to get things started and find them some office space, and then I resigned. And then I got a call from the White House. "You can't resign." I said, "Oh, yes, I can. This is a democracy." "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "Are you seriously going to support chemical safety in this country?" Now, this was the Clinton administration, all right? But they were being pressured by the chemical industry not to fund this group.
That's right.
Ironically, this Chemical Safety Investigation Board is finally now doing its job under the end of the Bush administration. And they went to the BP explosion that took place in Texas.
Right.
And they did a fabulous job there with the Republican appointees of investigating a terrible tragedy there, where there were more than a dozen people who died. And as you may know, this had major consequences for BP, because John Brown, their CEO, was a very popular fellow for a while, who had the motto for BP, they'd be called Beyond Petroleum, which sounds kind of catchy. John Brown has been removed in part because of these and other things that afflicted that company, that it couldn't just market its way out of problems of the environment. And this issue is one where the Republicans and Democrats have a lot of responsibility jointly.
You have a lot in common.
Yeah, I'm afraid
Question
so.
for you. What is estrogen, and does it cause cancer?
Estrogen is a hormone. We need hormones to live, all right? And like Mae West was wrong, you can have too much of a good thing, and you can have too much hormones, and you can have too much estrogen. And if you have too much estrogen over a period of your life, you can get cancer. So girls who have their periods start early in life, and women who enter menopause later in life, will have more estrogen in their lifetimes and have a greater risk of developing breast cancer.
You know, I say that because just 2 days ago, the LA Times and Orange County Register both had articles, and I'm leaving them with you. Women who took hormone replacement drugs still have a 27% higher risk of developing breast cancer 3 years after stopping placebo.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things we don't understand about breast cancer data and patterns. It's actually not that simple, because one of the reasons being that we don't always categorize breast cancer in the same way. There's a type of breast cancer called ductal carcinoma in situ, which some cancer registries don't list as a cancer. There's type 0, type 1. Stages are not always uniformly recorded. Some cancer registries record stage 0 and 1, some only record more invasive cancers. But that new finding that just came out is very worrisome, because there were millions of women who were taking hormone replacement therapy under the mistaken notion that it was going to reduce their development of osteoporosis and improve their overall health. And now this most recent result suggests that there's a continuing risk of breast cancer. And we know that there are other health problems associated with prolonged use of hormone replacement therapy too, including deep vein thrombosis and heart attack.
To follow up on that, one of the things that, what birth control pills, for example, are progesterone, is that correct? Or
Well,
something?
ethinyl estradiol.
Exactly, and
Right.
that whatever that is that it causes the hair to grow on a woman's
can.
face. It
Right,
can,
right.
and it also usually can cause. They said breast cancer. Is it? And then the other one, if you use the estrogen, you wind up getting ovarian cancer, don't they?
Well, no, wait.
All right.
It's actually much more complicated.
Okay.
Birth control pills may protect against ovarian cancer,
Right.
but increase the risk of breast cancer.
Exactly. That's what.
So you got to choose your poison. Now, for young women, it's very difficult. I'm actually encouraged by some trials that we've been doing in Pittsburgh, looking at a silicone cap that fits on the cervix,
Right.
where you put a gel on the cap, and it provides birth control protection, and you don't have to be pumping the body full of hormones, because I think hormones are a mixed bag. The other thing about birth control pills is that they don't do anything at all to prevent the spread of HIV or sexually transmitted diseases.
Right.
And so I think that we still have a way to go when it comes to providing a safe form of birth control for women.
Well, let's.
Let me just jump,
go
I
ahead,
want to
yeah.
jump back to
Sure.
something else. You've done so much work. You've written, 170 scientific journals of one form or another. You've edited 11 books, I think we read. But you also co-produced a documentary, an award-winning documentary featuring Olivia Newton-John. And the title was Exposure, Environmental Links to Breast Cancer. Other than the 7-minute clip that people can see on youtube.com, where can viewers see this movie?
Well, actually, I think they can order it from Amazon. And it's
Oh, that's great.
And it exists in Spanish, Chinese, English, French, and Italian that I know of. So it's actually made it around the world. And at one point got first prize from the New York Film Festival for science documentary.
Congratulations.
Well,
We
thank
enjoyed
you.
watching that.
Thank
We
you.
did.
Thank you.
Now, you said something else in some of your writing. The most influential Supreme Court ruling in 1993 we've never heard of. Can you share
Yes.
anything on that for our
Well, the
readers?
Dalbert decision was actually a culmination of many years of debate over
Repeat that name again.
Dalbert, Daubert,
All right.
and pronounced Daubert.
Okay.
For the French would be Daubert,
All right.
but the Dalbert, as the Americans say, the Dalbert decision. The Dalbert decision had many aspects of it, but the one that I'm concentrating on is this. It involved a case involving a drug that was used, bendectin, was prescribed for women to prevent miscarriages. And bendectin, according to several different studies, was associated with a slight increase in birth defects in children of mothers who took it, right? But the analysis that was presented to the court consisted of animal evidence showing that when you exposed animals to bendectin and allowed them to live, you got an increase in these defects. And in addition, they took epidemiologic studies in humans, or case report, and combined them. And the court ruled that that combining of data from different studies wasn't okay. So the court got involved in what is the type of analysis you could do in human data, and by implication said that the animal data weren't dispositive, that they weren't really clear enough, that you needed proof of human harm. And my book and my life has been dedicated to saying that's the wrong approach. If we say that the only evidence we can say is definitive, that something causes cancer in humans, is when we have enough sick or dead people in a statistically significant number in a certain time, then what we're basically saying is we need to show which gun has fired which bullet into which organ at which time to cause which cancer. And that's a level of proof that we almost never have. Nor should we ever insist on that kind of proof, because what does that mean? It means that we are treating people like lab rats in an experiment to which none of us has ever consented.
Let me follow up on that very quickly. And the issue here transcends into Vioxx, a variety of,
Yes.
you can name several of drugs that were from major manufacturers throughout the world and were released and then determined that they had done great harm.
Yes,
And-
or the evidence on the harm has been covered up or squelched for a long time.
For a marketing purpose to
Right.
make a buck. Okay,
Right.
we understand that part, but the point is that how can these things, is it just the way they set up the rules of the game so that they can pass muster and get these new items out to market?
I think we're on the verge of a revolution here. And I think, in some sense, the Homeland Security demands, which we face, because I think terrorism is a real threat, is going to allow us to use the same tools that we use now to track whether or not emergency rooms are seeing an increase of an unusual type of disease, which we now can do because we have hooked up our emergency rooms electronically. So we can monitor things that we used to not be able to monitor.
Right.
Well, why not take that same thing and apply it to drug reactions? Why not have mandatory reporting of adverse drug reactions through pharmacies to computers?
To a database.
Right, and one of the proposals right now, I am deeply opposed to this direct marketing to consumers that's going on of drugs. You know, where people create a demand for syndromes, restless leg syndrome, for things that they're very, there is a problem with restless leg syndrome, but it's been vastly, like a lot of things, exaggerated. One of the proposals right now is to give people an 800 number or an email to send in adverse drug reaction reports. We don't have any mandatory reporting of adverse drug reactions. And an adverse drug reaction sounds like a benign thing, but it can be something very severe, like a bronchospasm, like great difficulty breathing, and even anaphylaxis. Now, you don't know, because I haven't written about it, that I actually almost died myself from an adverse drug reaction. A drug called Zomax in 1984. And that drug killed other people and almost killed me.
Wow.
And when I did the research afterwards, I learned that the company, it was Johnson & Johnson McNeil Pharmaceutical, had reports in their files of serious reactions, but had systematically understated the gravity of the reactions in their reports to FDA. And that pattern is something that we really can't accept any longer. And I think that with the use of electronic records and information, we will be able to get better information for people.
One of the things, wait, I just got to just follow this up real quickly. Again, I'm going to kind of recant back to our aging show we just did recently. And one of the things is about gene sequencing and understanding that if we could sequence your genes and then add these new drugs into the mix, we could tell very quickly whether or not you would get an adverse reaction or not if you had your genes sequenced. Do you think that's something down the road, a million years, or?
Well, you know, I think like a lot of things, it's a great idea, but I think the problems will be in its execution. We certainly know, for example, with advanced cancer patients, that we now know enough to know that there will be some patients in whom a drug will not work, and we ought to be able to figure that out before trying it. And there'll be others in whom a drug might work very well. But I'm not as sure that this offers the great promise for the rest of the world. And let me be clear. For us in the developed world, we can afford to try to do these things. But you know, most of the people in the world live on $2 a day. And there, I think, the case for cleaning up the environment, safer water, less air pollution, remains very, very strong. And so it becomes hard from a public health point of view, looking at the global perspective of infectious diseases and their spread and their control. Yes, I understand there's great potential with our ability to look at genotyping and understanding the diversity of responses. But I'm concerned about the really big picture here, and I think we need to come up with ways to provide a cleaner environment for everybody while we fine-tune what we can do with drugs. I'm interested in primary prevention. That means keeping people from getting sick in the first place.
There's the issue here, and I think it's not an anomaly, is we've all been watching the Keith Ledger magnetic cocktail of all these different drugs that he was taking. That's not very different than a lot of people that are on, let's say, blockers, beta blockers, and so on for high blood pressure and for blood thinners and all these other things that they start winding up. You go to the doctor for, and well, gee whiz, they've got edema of the heart muscle, so we have to give them this thing, and then we have to give them this, and then this, and then pretty soon you've got 5 or 6 drugs, and people are, they don't know how they're going to deal with all that variety of drugs at one time. How do we do that?
That's an excellent point. I think that Heath Ledger, it should be said, appears to have taken perfectly legal drugs and appears to have died from combining them. Now, you would never take all the drugs in your medicine chest at the same time, even though each one of them might be perfectly fine alone. And yet, when we set standards for environmental chemicals, we set them for each one at a time. And there's something wrong with that approach because life is a mixture. And we're exposed to combined effects of these things, and it's the combined effects over a lifetime that affects us. It affects our aging as well. And that's why I think we have to be smarter about figuring out how to do better with fewer chemicals and less dangerous things overall.
Well, I want to follow up on something you were talking about earlier. There was allegations of Eli Lilly, corruption involving the psychiatric drug Zyprexa. Are you familiar with that at all?
I know a little bit about it.
Okay. There's an issue that's very big in our community here in Orange County, and that's about cell towers with all of the carriers out there putting more and more artificial trees up. In one of your writings, you talk about the concern, even with the newest phones, for children. Can you elaborate on that for our viewers?
Well, the British government, the German government, the Bangalore, India, all strongly recommend that children not use cell phones, period. They do that because the standards for cell phones have been set for thermal effects, the heating effect. A cell phone applied directly to the brain is a microwave radiation signal, okay? And we know from the research of the cell phone industry that that microwave gets within 2 inches into the brain. Studies by Leonard Hardell in Sweden, where they've used cell phones longer than we have found when you combine data from more than a dozen different studies that people who've used cell phones for 10 years or longer have double the risk of certain types of tumor of the hearing nerve, acoustic neuroma, and double or triple the risk of brain cancer. Now, we haven't been using cell phones that long in the United States, and I'm very concerned about what the long-term effects will be of putting a phone next to your head. Now, that's a different type of exposure. Your phone next to your head is different than the cell tower will give you. And there are different types of electromagnetic fields. There's also high voltage switching stations and high voltage lines, which is an electromagnetic field. I can't tell you that these things are dangerous, but I cannot tell you that they're safe either. And I think we need to have truly independent resources to turn to get information on the safety or hazards of such things in our modern lives. That's a role for the government, and that's a role that the private sector needs that. And I think that we're going to have to come up with novel ways to fund really independent research at this point.
Let me come back to another point with you, and that's something that's popular today, Botox. Talk to us about, are there any risks involved with botulinum toxins, or however that's pronounced?
Botulinum toxins, yeah. I think that it's foolish, the extent to which it's being so widely used. I mean, it's appropriate if you have a serious neurological problems that might be disabling, it's appropriate. But the use of this in the beauty industry, there's a tremendous amount of things that we're doing that may prove to be very dangerous. And I think that we'll only know, the long-term effects years later. For many things in modern cosmetics and drugs, it's like shoot, ready, aim.
One of the things we're going to mention is that Leonard Garante is from MIT. He's a great doctor researcher in cell sirtuins and so on in the cell industry. He mentions the fact that Padina and some of these high resveratrol, these throwback things that are supposed to high energy, take away the lines and so on, are being made by people like Estee Lauder that are very powerful, and they do take away the lines.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know as you said, what the results might be over a period of time, do we?
Well, I would say there's certain things like hyaluronic acid, which is a natural constituent of the body, and certain things like perhaps resveratrol, which are natural products. I think they're less likely to be toxic than something like botulinum toxin, which is a poison. I mean, and I'm concerned about what that can do, or things that dissolve fat. Well, if you dissolve fat and you free it and it's going throughout the body, I think that, I'm fortunate that I'm coming by my gray naturally, and my grandmother grayed when she was 75, but I think we have to learn to be a little more comfortable.
Well, number one, you're a very beautiful lady in all respects, and everyone's going to look at you and say, okay, Dr. Davis, how do you choose your cosmetics? How do you pick them? How do you do it?
Well, I go with the biominerals type thing, which is more natural. The fewer ingredients, the better. There's a great beauty treatment that I do most nights, which is vitamin E or olive oil, and you dab it on, and it works. And sunscreens are always a little more problematic because there's some ingredients in sunscreens that can be difficult, and it's almost a crapshoot to figure out the safe things. I rely on groups like EWG.org, the Environmental Working Group, which has done a tremendous job of sort of looking at the array of these things. And there's a new book by Stacy Malkin on the beauty industry that's a fabulous expose of what we do and don't know.
What I'm going to ask is that what would you were in charge of that for that brief time until it got funded. Can you revisit the name of that?
The National Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board.
Having said that, you have an idea here on this, and I'd just like to know something. From your point of view, solely now, you're not involved in that directly, but you've got certainly an idea about it. What should be the ramifications to drug companies that produce these products and do supreme harm to other people without having the full testing done that needs to be done?
Well,
from your point of view.
I've called for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on toxic hazard because I think that the current system doesn't work. And what that means is that companies have information now about the harms of some of the products that they produced in the past. Not necessarily just cosmetics, but a whole bunch of things. And yet there's no incentive for them to come forward with information. And there's every incentive for them to stonewall. And in the case of Vioxx, as you know, that company stonewalled, so they protected themselves economically, and people who suffered adverse reactions have really retrieved very little compensation as a result. I think if we let companies come forward without risk of punitive damages, but willing to expend for medical costs and direct costs of damages, that might be a way to get more information forward. I think that would be an experiment worth pursuing, and I'm talking with people in the next month at Tulane Law School, at Georgetown, and others who are really legal theorists about how we could create a system that would provide us with more information.
You could almost do it in categories. You could phase it in, certain categories to start with, and then so on. Is that?
Well, I talked recently to the Heinz endowments about trying to start, perhaps, believe it or not, with the oil and gas industry, because they have opportunities now to clean up the environment in terms of microbes and things like that in oil and gas that might make their solutions a lot simpler. And we're looking for people who are interested in trying to come forward with this, because it's clear that the old adversarial system, it isn't working. And we really we owe our children and grandchildren better than this.
Two things that I've got to cover before we close out this great interview. One of the things is that throughout this country, whenever we have a termite, we have fumigation. And we have some, they have the orange oil as the least invasive all the way up the line, all the way to Vicane and methyl bromide and DDT and so on. And as Larry did some research and found out that you're one of your Keystone State people they're from Pennsylvania. Is it Keystone State? Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Rachel Carson came from an area outside of Pittsburgh, and
right.
I guess you're following well in her footsteps, but she was the leader against the DDT movement.
Right.
And so tell us, if you will, how much danger is there to the general public from just fumigating for, these bugs?
Right. Well, first of all, for termites, heat treatment can sometimes be used as well. So it's not only that you can rely on chemicals. And it is a problem, and figuring out what's called integrated pest management, which are biological methods to combine using natural products as well as sometimes using pesticides, is, I think, the wave of the future. I'm not opposed to pesticides. I'm just opposed to their misuse. And there's a lot of misuse that does go on now. The termite issue is very difficult, and I'm not an expert in the best way to deal with that problem. But there is no question that for the short term, the people who are most at risk from tenting and gassing are the workers and those who have immediate contact. And they're often not given an adequate protection as well. The United States today has stringent standards, but we don't have the means to enforce them. We don't have, for the federal level, funding. The state of California right now is in a crisis when it comes to funding for these things as well. And as a result, we're really flying blind on a lot of these things.
Okay, now, having said that about that particular danger to our society, if you had an unlimited budget, and that's really hilarious that you were really looking for a budget from your time in government. If, let's say, you had an unlimited budget with as much money as you needed, what would be the first thing that you would do as a director of an agency to change things in the United States regarding the safety of our lives?
I think that democracy rests on an informed public that freely consents to be governed. It's the basic tenet of Jeffersonian democracy. Now, we can't consent to be governed by things and compounds that we don't know about. So the fundamental right of a democracy is the right to know. I would start with informing people of the things we already know about, that the US government has documented do cause cancer and increase the risk of cancer. And there are several hundred compounds that have been identified, for example, of causing tumors in the breast, more than 220 of them. We haven't regulated many of them. I believe that informing people in a way that they can understand is critical to allowing democracy to exist. And when people have information, they can act. And what we're doing at the Center for Environmental Oncology is exactly that. What I'm doing with my book is to create information in a way people can understand so that they can feel empowered and they can do something about it. If people have information, then they can go to the market and they can say, we don't want your poisonous products in our homes and schools. I believe that girl cots are going to sweep the world, and they already are. A girl cot is the opposite of a boycott. A boycott means no. It means I won't buy your product. Women are responsible for spending 85 cents out of every dollar in the United States today. And they are increasingly saying, we don't want poisons in our children's lunch and in schools and homes. And we want the right to buy safer, cleaner, and healthier products. So again, the market is working here, and women generally are leading the charge because they're becoming more aware about some of these dangers. And there's a growing awareness, particularly for young parents like my daughter-in-law and son, who are saying, I want to know what's safe, and I don't want to wait until my kid develops asthma or continues to develop ear infections or has a learning problem to understand that this flame retardant that we've been pumping into all of our furniture and draperies and foam is causing thyroid disease and learning problems.
Okay, last thing, I got to get this in because all the women under 40, we saw an article that you'd written recently about breast examinations and this arcane process of squeezing the breast down and all that stuff. And you had a few points on that. I've got about 30 seconds left. Can you tell us what your point is?
Well, we've got to develop a blood or urine test to predict risk of breast cancer and intervene earlier. And mammography is a very blunt instrument that doesn't prevent breast cancer. It only finds it early, and it doesn't find it early enough. So my advice is that regular breast exam is a very important tool for finding irregularities of the breast. And a regular breast exam should be done once a year by a health professional, and it should take long enough that the woman wonders whether the person performing it is enjoying themselves.
Dr. Devra Davis, we're completely out of time. We could spend several hours with you, and God bless you for the work that you're doing. In any way we can do to help you in the future, Cutting Edge is here to help you, and thank you so very much for joining us today on The Cutting Edge.
Well, thank you very much, and next time I have to talk to Anna more, huh?
Yes.
All right.
Let me just say, for MM Magazine, having you listed as one of the top 50 women in America, as it says in the Mishnah, Tikkun Olam means leave the world a better place. Your commitment is a mitzvah. Shalom.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shalom.
This was fun.
It's a picture in the mind's eye of a girl, now a doctor. A steel mill neath the yellow sky, behind a greenhouse and grandmother. Grandma tells the story of the days with the weather.